Greetings. Let us go ahead and spend a few minutes on Chapter 5, Early and Classical Criminological Theories. And here we begin to look at several theoretical approaches and some of the major assumptions behind these approaches and how these approaches might be applied in research and policy making. Remember that theory helps us to understand and explain crime and try to make sense of what's going on. And I would also mention that there are going to be multiple theories that we discuss and use throughout the course, and one theory is not necessarily better than another theory. You'll find that all of these theories have both advantages as well as disadvantages. And you'll find that you have a preference probably for one or several theories over the other ones. Now, if we look historically at some of the approaches, your author discusses demonological theory or supernatural explanations of crime. In other words, people might be possessed by demons and commit crimes because of this possession. And one example I would give that comes to mind right away would be the Salem witchcraft trials, the Salem witch trials. And if you read about those trials, you'll see that a small group of powerful men in the community went ahead and prosecuted some women and men claiming that they were witches and a danger to the community, and actually ended up killing some of these victims. And at that particular time in history, it is interesting to look at the social conditions and the changes and how those particular ideas came about and how the allegations were made. And by our standards today, this seems a bizarre scenario. Some of the other theoretical approaches falling into the classical theory emphasize free will and rationality. In other words, people choose to commit crimes. They make decisions, often rational decisions, to make crimes. That there is a pleasure principle, a principle or assumption of hedonism, that people try to maximize pleasure while minimizing pain. And Cesare Beccaria, writing in the 1700s, talked about the goal was to reform criminal law and punishment in ways that were going to work better based on this idea of free will and people choosing to commit crimes. So Beccaria said that punishment should be swift and certain, and it should be no more severe than necessary to prevent crime. And we see many of these ideas in our modern criminal justice and legal systems. And Jeremy Bentham, writing in the 1700s and early 1800s, talked about how punishment should be utilitarian, that basically he believed that we should have all of this punishment and addressing crime based on the idea that we should have the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And of course, what you want to think about here is how do we decide what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people? And again, we get right into that problem of how do we come up with objective criteria to decide what is criminal and what is not. I mean, if someone breaks into their neighbor's house and takes their jewelry one evening, they would be considered a criminal engaging in burglary, engaging in theft. In contrast, if someone breaks into their neighbor's house and pulls them out of a fire, then they would be considered a hero. But they still broke into the house in that sense. They broke down the door. So we need to take into consideration other factors, and that really is where the neoclassical theory became more prominent, bringing in the idea that we need to consider the environment, the psychological makeup of the person, and other mitigating factors, and of course the context of the situation. And the neoclassical theorists focused more on policies rather than the causes of crime. What can we do to prevent what we've decided is criminal behavior? And some of their approaches, for example, include rational choice theory. Remember, the whole idea of that people making decisions to engage in crime. Now, it may not seem rational to you, it may not seem rational to me, it may not seem rational to many people, but the idea here is that the person does have a mental calculus of the risks of getting caught and the risks of getting caught, the benefits associated with committing the crime, and so forth. So they may do an actual cost-benefit analysis in their head. And one of the things we can do here is situational crime control, that we set up situations to prevent crimes based on this whole idea. We make it more difficult for people to commit crimes. And some of these neoclassical theory approaches led to such policies as the just deserts or the three strikes, and also mandatory sentencing policies. And the idea is to prevent people from committing crimes by setting particular parameters. For example, that people may not speed if they know that there are law enforcement officers with radar detectors, or they won't run red lights if they know there's red light cameras, or they won't break into buildings if they know there are alarms and video cameras, and so on. Human ecology is another theory that looks at the relationship between humans and the physical environment. And you see a lot more of this geographical analysis of crime, looking at where crime rates tend to be higher or lower, and some of the social conditions in those areas. A lot of this type of research is generated from looking at official statistics. What we know is that, for example, the homicide rates vary by city to city, and even certain locations within a city, the homicide or even the assault rates, for example, will vary. And we can try to figure out what is it about the particular location that may increase or decrease crime. Moving toward an economic theory of crime, really the historical figure there is Karl Marx, writing in the 1800s, and pointing out that capitalism and inequality is really the root cause of all social problems, including crime. And so here we begin to see the idea that crime is generated from inequalities in society, and that the laws, the criminal justice system, and the entire societal institutions are really set up to benefit and protect the wealthy and powerful. And many times those that are in lower socioeconomic status situations are more likely to be arrested and prosecuted, and also convicted and sentenced. So in this short chapter, we briefly reviewed demonological, the classical, and then neoclassical, the ecological, and the economic theories of crimes. And there's some really useful charts in your textbook, or tables in your textbook. I believe it's table 5.3, looks at the theory and then kind of looks at the notions, key notions of the crime causation, or the ideas of what generates the crime, and then the policies. And so I just want to go over that real briefly, and then we will wrap this up. But the demonological, the key notions there is that supernatural forces lead to criminality, and the policies related to, for example, torture or exorcism. The classical and the neoclassical focused on the idea that criminals are rational actors and they are responsible for their actions because they have free will. Although the neoclassical did point out that there are some psychological and environmental factors, structural factors, that may influence whether one engages in criminal behavior or not. And the idea there is that punishment should fit the crime. With the ecological model, we look at group characteristics and social and physical environments that lead to crime or prevent crime. And here we look at changing the physical and social environment to conditions that have been demonstrated to decrease crime. And with economic theory, we look at inequalities in society, and the policies there are really to reduce inequality and especially to reduce poverty, and this will lead to a decrease in crime. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.